So last week we finished talking about the transition from Saul to David after the death of Saul. In 2 Samuel 8:15, it says, "So David reigned over all Israel, administering justice and righteousness for all his people." So after several years, a total of 22 years, David is reigning over everything. The kingdom is now fully under his control. He's ruling and reigning, a man after God's own heart, ruling and reigning over Israel. Now, the story I want to tell you about tonight is interesting because there were still some of Saul's descendants that were left in the land. Now, if we know anything from history and even from Bible history, transitions of power are usually not pretty at all. I mean, even this one had a little bit of a rough start. It took 7 years to fully get the kingdom under David's control. But transitions of power are very ugly. I mean, even in the Bible, there's a story of a lady named Queen Athaliah who murdered all of her grandchildren so that she could keep power. Or she thought she had murdered. There was one that the priests had set aside and he became king later. But she literally killed all of her grandkids. If you can imagine that, if you have grandkids, murdering all of your grandkids so that you can stay in power. Just throughout the transitions in the stories of 1 Kings, 2 Kings, 1 Chronicles, 2 Chronicles, all the different times that new kings came into power, they're almost always accompanied by murder, lies, conspiracies, overthrowing kingdoms and governments and betrayal, all of this thing. Well, with David, this story stands out in contrast to that because David had such a heart. You're going to see this in the story we're going to talk about tonight, which is the story of a man by the name Mephibosheth. Mephibosheth, now you'll remember another name, Ishbosheth. Ishbosheth from last week, that was King Saul's son. But King Saul had another son named Jonathan, who was David's friend, and Jonathan had a son named Mephibosheth. So this would be King Saul's grandson. And at the time that David has secured the kingdom, Mephibosheth is still alive, but practically he's in hiding at this point because of the very thing we were talking about before. Mephibosheth doesn't know if David is going to try to come and kill him and exterminate him, which would be the normal thing that kings would have done at this point. They would have taken all the descendants of someone like King Saul and killed them because they don't want any rivalry. They don't want anybody that could potentially overthrow them in the future. 2 Samuel 9, our story picks up tonight. David asked, "Is there anyone remaining from Saul's family that I can show kindness to because of Jonathan?" There was a servant of Saul's family named Ziba. They summoned him to David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba? I am your servant," he replied. So the king asked, "Is there anyone left of Saul's family that I can show the kindness of God to?" So this tells us so much, again, about David. The fact that he's even asking this question, why is he worried about that? You would think if he would be worried about it, it would be because he's trying to find him so he can kill him. But David is saying, is there anyone left in Saul's family that I can show kindness to? Normally, people in David's position would be fearful. They would be paranoid. That's the pattern you see. I think the reason that David was able to have peace and faith and kindness in this moment is because he knows that it was God that put him in that position. He's not worried about his position. He knows it was God. Think about the process it took to get him here. He's confident in that. This has been a 22-year process to get to where I'm at right now. And there's no denying that God established him all the way. So he's not afraid of Mephibosheth or anyone else for that matter. He knows God put him there and only God can take him out. So he's not worried about it. Ziba said to the king, "There is still Jonathan's son who was injured in both feet." The king asked him, "Where is he?" Ziba answered the king, "You'll find him in Lodabar at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel." So King David had him brought from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lodabar. Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, son of Saul, came to David, bowed down to the ground, and paid homage. David said, "Mephibosheth, I am your servant," he replied. "Don't be afraid," David said to him, "since I intend to show you kindness because of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all your grandfather Saul's fields and you will always eat meals at my table." Mephibosheth bowed down and said, "What is your servant that you take an interest in a dead dog like me?" Then the king summoned Saul's attendant Ziba and said to him, "I have given to your master's grandson all that belonged to Saul and his family." This is amazing. So at this point in David's life, the kingdom has grown. He's got rest on every side. God is blessing him. And the kingdom has grown. It has expanded. And King David tells Mephibosheth, "I'm going to give you everything that belonged to your grandfather Saul." So in other words, when I took over, the kingdom was this big. And since I've been king, it's this big. The place that it was at whenever I took over, I'm going to give you all of that. Everything that was King Saul's, I'm going to give back to you. And this is totally undeserved. This was way beyond anything that was expected, anything that Mephibosheth was expecting. But that was the heart that David had. Verse 11, "So Mephibosheth ate at David's table just like one of the king's sons." What a powerful example of just true character, of the true heart of God. First of all, to not be intimidated or fearful by someone that could potentially usurp you or usurp your authority or your power, and instead to show kindness to them. I'm thinking about in our lives, how do we apply this? Because whether it's at your job or family or whatever, there's always those situations where there are those people that we could be intimidated by. We see them as a threat maybe to our position of power. This is how so much ugliness can happen in politics, and backbiting and backstabbing can happen. People feel threatened, and rather than helping someone that's under them, they just roadblock them every step of the way. They want them to fail. They don't want them to succeed, and the real reason is because they're threatened by them. And what just awesome character in King David to have someone like Jonathan's grandson that could have been a problem for him later down the road. And he said, "No, I'm going to show him kindness. I'm going to even give him land. I'm going to give him servants. I'm going to give him fields. I'm going to give him everything that his grandfather had." So in our lives, who are those people? What are those situations that we could be intimidated by or fearful about, but instead we're going to say, "You know what? I'm going to show kindness. I'm going to help you. I'm going to teach you what I know and try to help you get further along than me and hope you do better than me. Hope you succeed better than me." That's the heart of God, and that's the heart that David had here. Actually, Paul tells us to do this in the New Testament in Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. He says, "Do nothing out of rivalry or conceit, but in humility consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others." Well, if we were all living that way, the world would look a lot different. The workplace would look a lot different. Families would look a lot different if we were all not just looking out for ourselves, but looking out for others. And as he said here, actually considering other people more important than ourselves. That would change everything. And this was the heart of David. Now, as we're going to find out next week, David was not perfect in this. David made some huge mistakes. So David was not perfect. David did not always do everything right, but he did make some mistakes in this area. But in this case, he truly demonstrated the heart of God for Mephibosheth. The other big point, obviously, here is that this is a perfect example of what the gospel is. And that's really the biggest part of this story, and I believe that's why this story is even in the Bible, is because it's actually a perfect representation of the gospel. You have David, who has pretty much, you might as well say, all power and all authority in this moment. Mephibosheth is, as he said himself, a dead dog and has no power, no influence. He's even handicapped. So he's totally helpless, totally undeserving of any kind of favor, any kind of mercy. And yet David extends this act of mercy to him. Not only does he extend the act of mercy, he makes him like a son. And he invited him to sit at the king's table for the rest of his life. He ate all of his meals at the table of King David, just like one of his sons. And that is exactly the gospel. That is exactly what Jesus did for us. He showed us mercy. God showed us mercy. And he didn't just make us a slave or a servant. He didn't just forgive us. That would have been enough. But more than that, he invited us to sit at his table as sons of God and to be in fellowship with him, to constantly be in his presence, in and around him. That it is the gospel. And even another major point of similarity between this story and the gospel is the reason why David continually says he's doing this. He says, for the sake of your father, Jonathan. In other words, he was telling Mephibosheth, I'm not even really doing this for you. I'm doing this because of the merit of another. I'm doing this because of the merit of your father, Jonathan, because of the covenant I have with him. And it's the same with God. God is doing what he's doing for us. He did what he did for us because of his covenant with Jesus. He's saying, yeah, I love you. You're great, but you actually don't deserve this. But for the sake of my son, because of the covenant I made with my son, you're invited in. You're part of the family. You're forgiven. You're given that influence. You're receiving that restoration. So the most beautiful part of this story is the story of the gospel.